Welcome to Books of Our Time, brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss a book about the Internet entitled Blown to Bits. Two of its three co-authors, Professors Harry Lewis of Harvard and Hal Abelson of MIT, are with me today to discuss their book. Professor Lewis is a former dean of Harvard College and is a professor of computer science at Harvard. He is the author of numerous articles on various aspects of computer science. Professor Abelson is a professor of electrical engineering and computer science at MIT. He has had a worldwide impact on university computer science education. As said, these two professors are with me today, and I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Gentlemen, thank you for joining the long gray line from Cambridge, which has come up here on a regular basis, I am pleased to say. And Harry, I think this is the second time you did that.
It is. Thanks for having me back.
Tell us why you wrote the book. I gather from the book that digitization has progressed so far and so quickly that you think we're at some form of historical crossroads in regard to privacy and freedom and technology. Tell us your views on that and on why you wrote the book. And I guess we can start with you, Hal.
Well, what's happening is things are starting to change so fast that even for people like Harry and me, who've been in this business a long time, it's just surprising to us how things are changing. And it's that things have reached a stage where there are now enormous differences happening, much more so than before. It's only recently been the case that we can remember everything about your life, that there's enough storage around to just never have to delete everything, never have to forget anything. It's only been recently that we can really cheaply have real-time video conferences across the world, and we all kind of knew it was coming, and those of us in the computer business sort of said, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, but now it's here. And kind of what's not here is the adjustment of our attitudes towards this thing. So, you know, it was nice to say, gee, in the future, I'll be able to know where all of my friends are. Yeah. And now I can know where all my friends are. Yeah. And I don't know how to think about that. So it's somehow the technology's been moving fast, but our attitudes and our intuitions about stuff haven't been moving. And it's that kind of disruption and that discontinuity that the book's really about.
Yeah. You remember in 1964 when AT&T was going to show picture tell at the World's Fair?
That's right.
That was the biggest deal going, and then nothing happened for the next 20 years.
That's right.
Because various technological growth factors took a while to reach the stage where all of a sudden these things which science fiction writers predicted might someday be possible, you know, actually became possible, and moreover became possible over a period of a very few years, and young people, you know, people who are now teenagers or young adults, in some ways have never known the world any differently than the fact that everything is communicable everywhere instantly. Everything can be constantly remembered.
Harry, this is fundamentally, if I understand your book correctly, this is fundamentally due to the vast increase in capacity due to Moore's law, due to better algorithms, which you can explain what algorithms are, all of which has created such fantastically immense capacity in such a very short period. Is that roughly right?
Yeah, I think there's a series of technological changes, and they're driven by some common underlying changes in electrical engineering or advances in electrical engineering. So Hal mentioned the first and most important one, the capacity to store everything. There's huge increases in storage. There's huge increases in communication speed. The internet now, a worldwide network, so the information can be sent everywhere in the flash of an eye. There's huge increases in processor speed, so that the algorithms, the processing methods that are needed for recognizing faces in photographs and doing that kind of thing now actually work. They've been laboratory exercises for years. And then the fourth thing that has exploded, in the metaphor of the subtitle of our book, which we call Your Life, Liberty, and Happiness After the Digital Explosion, the fourth thing that's exploded is the number of sensors. That is to say, the number of cameras in people's cell phones, cameras that are mounted as, you know, for security purposes, microphones in your OnStar system in your car, all of these places that are potential ways of gathering information that are now, you know, they're now consumer goods. They're not just the instruments of police states or something like that.
When are they going to come up? You see, I was the last generation of human beings, males only, that didn't learn to type. So I've never learned to use a computer. So my question is, when are we going to have voice recognition technology so good that I can use a computer without knowing how to type? That should be coming pretty soon, shouldn't it?
You know, that's the thing that's been coming imminently for about the last 10 years.
Like picture tone.
And you know, and it's not quite good enough. And it's only, you know, 95% is not good enough, because at 95% it takes you longer to correct the mistakes than it was to type it in the first place.
You know, the current generation of speech recognition software that people use for typing is actually quite good and doesn't have to be trained. And there are, I think, only at this point experimental, not commercial, but nonetheless I will expect will be commercial shortly, sort of audio search engines. So you say, you know, ask for a word and it'll go search a bunch of audio files on the internet to find it. So these kinds of technologies are becoming commercial reality.
I'm going to lose my excuse in short order, aren't I? Tell me something. I was fascinated, and I am fascinated by the fact, and you have a lot of descriptions about this at one place and another in the book, by the fact that once you type something into your computer and send it, and particularly after you send it, press that send button, it's out there forever. And there's no way, there seems to be almost no way of wiping the slate clean. You might, if you do everything right, be able to wipe clean your computer itself, but then this would still remain in what you folks call the core architecture, all the machines throughout the world over which this message passed. So, does this mean that when the current administration passes, we happen to be taping this show, ladies and gentlemen, on the very day of the election, when this current administration passes and tries to wipe its computers clean in order to avoid historical condemnation, if not condemnation in law, they won't succeed.
Now, how many people in the current administration you think right now are making little private copies of stuff that just for their own fun or edification, to show to their in-laws 5 years from now? And that stuff gets around, and gosh, you know, you can copy on a little flash drive that's this big right now. You couldn't quite do that.
Well, I mean, you take the things, there are a lot of, for example, there are a lot of memoranda from the Department of Justice which have never been released yet.
Sure.
And even if Obama wins, he may choose not to release them.
Yeah, of course not.
But those are not just in the Department of Justice computers. Those are in core architecture, what in effect are computers all over the world.
Well, they're probably sitting in backup systems in the White House. They're sitting around. They're sitting in little collections that people make.
Yeah.
Because again, remember, you can go buy one of these little flash drives right now.
Yeah.
Right. That holds what do they hold? You can buy one that holds 4 gigabytes now. That's enough that's enough to record everything that happened all the time you were in the White House.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just put it in your pocket.
Yeah.
And yes, it's very hard to know where those bits are, those zeros and ones are, who's walked out with those in their in their pocket, or who sent something in an email that has been stored away and may come back to life.
Yeah.
You know, 5 years from now. It's not so much that it's impossible to get rid of things, but it's impossible really to know where all the copies have gone.
You gentlemen talk in the book about people trying to wipe their disks clean.
Right.
And how they fail to do it, and they don't even understand that you virtually can't do it unless you use some Microsoft thing and use it exactly right. Yeah. And most people don't do that. Is that correct? So they think they've gotten rid of stuff, but they haven't.
Not only disk drives, but cell phones even. By the way, it's very hard to wipe clean a disk. There is software to do it. If you use the right software, you know, it can be done. But most of the methods that people think get rid of stuff, like dragging files into the trash can or using the Microsoft operating system format command, don't really do it. And one of the stories we tell, which is really quite really quite stunning. It was done by a researcher named Simpson Garfinkel, who's now on the West Coast, and Simpson, while he was at MIT, I believe, just bought a bunch of used disk drives off eBay. And people thought that they'd cleaned them up, but he was able to recover credit card numbers and psychiatric histories and all kinds of things that were there that, you know, if you just use the ordinary tools of the operating system, you might not have seen. And the same thing, as I say, cell phones, which is also a little scary. You buy a used cell phone, you know, there may well be stuff on it.
It is this, well, related, I take it, is that capacity, which you're speaking of, the inability to get rid of what was stored via capacity, is so great that when those 2 disks were lost in the mail in Britain, something like the information, Social Security and banking information of 25 million Britons was potentially compromised because of 2 disks.
Records on everybody who is receiving child support payments, which is everybody who has a child in England. So it was most of the population. And the same thing happened just a few days ago in England. The British seems to be having a lot of trouble with this.
You have told me that there's some things you found out in writing this book that startled even you. So perhaps you can briefly describe, I'll run through a number of them. Perhaps you can just briefly tell people what we're talking about here. Persons can be tracked via their own cell phones even though they don't know it, correct?
Right, well that's, I mean, startling is funny. It's in a sense being startled without being surprised. It's because of the way we think about stuff. So if I ask you, you know, do you walk around all the time carrying a microphone that can bug you? You'd say, what are you, crazy? If I say, you say, that's not a microphone, that's my phone. God, well, actually, my phone must have a microphone in it. And it's sort of that kind of being startled, that we have these illusions about, hey, this is just a phone, it's not a microphone. Hey, this is just a thing where I can send a message that says where I am. It's not a thing that knows where I am. And it's not surprise.
Well, it can be programmed, or when you buy it, it can come programmed to broadcast all the time so that it's never off, and if somebody wants to track you.
Well, it does broadcast all the time. If it wasn't broadcasting all the time, how do you think you would ever get a cell phone? It's a cell call.
Well, can't you,
how would it know where
they tell me if I do what they call a hard stop or something like that, I can actually turn the thing off until
you can take the battery off. Take the battery out.
Oh, that's the only way?
Well, it's an interesting. There's an interesting. I mean, there's this interesting. You know, you think that the power button on your cell phone will shut it off. Mine happens to put up a black screen and says goodbye and all the rest of that. But it turns out even that can be reprogrammed remotely so that it doesn't actually shut the cell phone off. And the federal investigators actually have used that against people they've investigated for federal crimes, to reprogram their phone so that even though the phone says goodbye, it's actually still on and listening and broadcasting to the federal authorities everything that the person was saying. That was actually evidence that was introduced in a case.
And you have a story. One of the points you keep making is that technology can be used for good or ill, so that just as it is used conceivably for ill, maybe for good, when the federal government remotely programs your cell phone so that you're broadcasting all the time, so too they found a woman who had been lost for 7 days after a car accident because they finally decided we're going to use her cell phone.
I think the more surprising thing is that these are now choices that all of us can make. So if I were to ask you 10 years ago, would you like to know where your 5 best friends are all the time? You might think that is this insane, intrusive, what kind of weirdo person would you be that I'm even asking you that? Well, you ask kids today, would you like to know where your 5 best friends are? They'll say, of course I want to know that. And then you turn around and you say, would you like your 5 best friends to always know where you are all the time? They'll say, yeah, sure, why not?
They don't ask husbands and wives this, do they? Can a parent go to whomever he's got to go to and say, I want to know where my kid is all the time, and have the kid's cell phone programmed by remote so that the parent can always tell where the kid is?
I don't think you can do it quite by remote, but you can have it set up so that the cell phone does it. There's a service you can buy, I think it's called Luft, which says on my buddy list on my phone, I would like those people on my buddy list to always be notified of my location. And you can just do that. Now the interesting thing is that's a free service, and Luft at least was selling as a premium service that you can instruct it to lie. So if you have it
to lie?
To lie. So if you have a kid and your parents want to know where you are all the time, yeah, they can know where you are all the time, but you can occasionally have it lie and say that you're in school when you're not.
But you know, one of the things that we try to stress in this book, in spite of its somewhat dramatic title and some of these strange things, is that there are wonderful applications of these technologies also. That it's not just people who want to do things that older people find spooky. Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, the Shop Savvy is a nice example. I've got it in my pocket here, although I don't know if it makes much sense to demonstrate on TV. But I basically I go into a store, and there's a piece of clothing, and it has a barcode on it. So I take my phone, and I turn on my phone, and I point the phone camera at the barcode. And the phone says, I know what that is. It's that kind of brand of shirt, and here's what it costs down the street. So it costs $25 where I'm looking, and you can get it for $21.99 down the street. And not only that, you can get it for $18.79 on the internet. And that's a wonderful thing. But you know what? That means the phone knows where I am. That means that the company that's running this service knows where I am. And these are trade-offs now we have. It's my trade-off that I'm happy to tell this company where I am in order to save $4? Well, probably yes.
Think of it. 18 years ago, the first George Bush didn't even know what a barcode was.
But people, this is as a social phenomenon, this is one of the interesting things. You ask people whether they value their privacy, and they'll say yes. Yeah. But they'll sell it very cheap.
Yeah,
very cheap.
Elaborate on that. Elaborate on that, because the corporations, the stores when you walk in, the corporations, they are picking up amounts of information on people that are staggering.
Well, the classic example of this that's been around for years is the so-called supermarket loyalty cards, where you register and you get a car from your supermarket, and then you get what they call a 5% discount or something on certain selected items of food, in exchange for scanning your card at the time that you check out. But what that really is a tax that we pay if we want our privacy preserved, right? Because now, by using your supermarket loyalty card, you're telling the supermarket, everything about your dietary habits, and also maybe about your drinking habits, and maybe about your habits in certain pharmaceuticals that you might buy, or other health equipment that you might buy at the supermarket when you check out. And people don't think about it. I mean, we happen to be living here in a state where by law they have to give you the same discount if you simply ask the checkout clerk to use their own card rather than yours, but that's not true in most of the country.
And I think you pointed out in the book that in certain kinds of retail businesses, when you walk in, a hotel, for example, or various retail businesses, you walk in, they have these records of everything you've ordered, and they can tell you how to mix and match with your pants and your suit coat, and they will, of course, approach you to do this, as I understand it, because it helps them make sales.
Well, but of course they do, because they bill you. And of course the hotel knows every time you went into your room, because there was this passcode, there's this electronic card they gave you. And again, these are things that we don't think about.
Can I repeat that? Every time you walk into the room, they know.
Well, there's an electronic lock.
Because of the electronic lock.
Right, so they know where you are.
That gets recorded somewhere, and some of that information can be very important for forensic purposes later in case of crimes being committed.
Same thing when you pass, on the freeways, when you have to pay, or else you have one of those cards and so forth.
Oh, that happens. I mean, you're the lawyer. That's step one these days in any divorce proceeding.
Yeah.
Which is you go.
Well, I wouldn't know about that, but I have read.
Right, you go in and you subpoena the turnpike to see where this guy was driving.
Let me ask you about something that's another useful aspect of this, because, and you might explain this a bit, because digitization causes absolutely pluperfect copies to be made. You get things like X-rays being read in India and being transmitted to India before you could carry them up to the next floor in the hospital.
Right. It's faster to send the digital X-ray halfway around the world than it is to physically carry an X-ray up to the radiology department, you know, that's one flight up the stairs in the hospital.
Yeah.
Now I should say, there are licensing laws that say, you know what the qualifications of people have to be in order for these X-rays to be read abroad and so on. The regulatory system has kicked in to a certain extent. But this is really Tom Friedman's "the world is flat." You know, that's really what this is. That so much of modern business and commerce and culture runs on information now, and communicating bits is so cheap. That there's no rational. I mean, you know, a more homely example, which is the one, you know, that I love, is that there are McDonald's restaurants where, or some chain, maybe it's not McDonald's, where when you go up to the window, the drive-in window, and give your order, the order is not being taken down by somebody sitting inside the restaurant. It's being taken down by somebody halfway around the world, you know, and then emailed back or electronically transmitted back.
That's just strange. But that's not only digital stuff. I mean, the one that blew me away when I was in Seattle, reading the paper there, and it turns out that there's the cheapest way if you're in Seattle to get salmon boned is you take the salmon and you put them on a plane and send them to China, where they're boned, and then the boned salmon are sent back. So this is about the communications infrastructure in the world.
Yes,
it's not only about digital information.
It's about that, and it's about the fact that it is less expensive in India or China because the labor costs are so tremendous.
And it makes up for the cost of shipping these salmon halfway around the world.
Yeah, right. And when you're sending X-rays to India, there's almost no cost. You know, it's curious, and you discussed this extensively. It's curious that in the middle of all this phenomenally increasing access to materials, including, by the way, and this was interesting, a digression, but it was interesting, that courts have been in the habit of saying for years, oh, that's a public record. Well, yes, technically they were public records, but, you know, if we're talking about a record in Seattle and you're living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it's not for practical purposes. Today it is. But you were talking about, did they pronounce it Doomsday or Domesday Book?
I
think they say Doomsday Book.
Doomsday Book. That's what I think too. And you were explaining how it got lost, which is amazing, and had to be recovered. Why don't you just elaborate
that?
Right,
so that was an amazing story. So the Doomsday Book was 1084 or something?
Yeah, it was in the 11th century.
Something like that.
But
in any case,
1086.
1086. But an example of the wonderful powers of digitization, right? In 1986, they decided to digitize this and put it all online, and they made a big deal of doing this. And within a few years, the data formats had changed to the point where that digital copy they'd made only a few years before were unreadable. And what was funny is, of course, the original Doomsday Book, you could still go back 1,000 years and read it. So one of the ways that stuff gets lost is that they get encoded in such a way that the software to decode them no longer exists.
Yeah.
So that's a way that things can get lost.
Did something like that happen with Y2K or whatever they call that? You know, they thought everything was going to collapse at the year 2000.
Everybody was worried about that. There was this idea that, you know, the next digit is, the 1,000 to 2,000 digit is going to roll over and some terrible thing's going to happen. It mostly didn't happen. There are all these people who made a big living by
Had they
predicting
forgotten how the format of programming that?
No, it wasn't a question of forgetting the program. It was just that when Hal and I were writing those codes back when we were in our 20s, you know, the amount of computer memory was so expensive that to keep saying 19, 19, 19, 19, 19 for every year when it was always 19 something, you know, we just were trying to save a few bucks. I'm not talking about Hal and me, I'm talking about our generation of programmers. And now, of course, you know, the memory's so cheap that issue isn't significant anymore.
Radio identification tags.
Radio frequency IDs,
RFIDs. Explain that. I have I found I saw a place in downtown Boston, Beacon Street, and people are waving their cards in front of the door and getting in when they wave their card. Explain how that works.
Well, it's basically a little tag, and it's got a number on it effectively, and this tag is readable at short-range radio. So the quote receiver broadcasts a little thing at the electronic tag, and the electronic tag responds, and then you can read the thing, and they're very small and they're very portable, and there's arguments about the range over which they can be read and the power at which they can be read, but basically you can stick them anywhere, and the difference between a tag is that instead of having 3 digits on it, you can put 50 digits on it, which means you can make a separate barcode for every single can of Coke. I don't mean a barcode that says this is Coke. I mean a barcode that says it's that can. And then
can
later,
2,530,000, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, and then I can say, gee, you know, that can that was sitting in the tray that I find in the dump was the one that was bought from this 7-Eleven on that date and came from this factory.
Very useful in forensics, I would say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely useful.
It's very useful, but it's also very useful commercially if you can get them installed in, you know, in various goods, because it enables. I mean, you know, if it enables the scenario that we describe. Just imagine this is not an actual scenario where you have an RFID in a piece of clothing which you buy in a store. You pay with a credit card, so they know the name of the person who bought that dress or whatever. Okay, and now you walk into the same chain store halfway around the world, you walk in and you can be greeted by name, because as you walk through, if you happen to be wearing that item of clothing, the thing would be scanned. And there's various rules and customs and practices, but there are stores that are experimenting with things that feel a little more intrusive than some people might be comfortable with.
Department store in Germany.
Department store in Germany, which experimented with the idea of putting RFIDs on everything, and then when you go into the dressing room, little on the computer monitor in the dressing room, it comes up, it notices what you're wearing, and it makes various suggestions. Oh, this necktie would go very nicely with that jacket that you're trying on, and it suggests color coordination, so on and so forth. So again, there are ways that these things can be helpful, or that some might think that they would be helpful, but they're also implying that a great deal more tracking than and you might feel comfortable with.
I meant to mention, so I will mention it. Don't they? What they can do with a cell phone by remote control, they can do that with the OnStar system on Cadillacs, right?
Right. That's
and they do that.
And they do do that.
They do that.
They do that. So yes, the OnStar system is the system where if you roll into a ditch or if you push the button, the nice woman comes on and tells you, asks you if you're okay, or tells you where the nearest pizza parlor is, or
and if
whatever.
Somebody wants to overhear your conversation, they can remotely program that on the OnStar system too.
Just turn it on and listen. That's a radio communication, and it's a very interesting matter because that particular radio channel between the OnStar system and headquarters is not covered under telecommunications law. That's not considered a telephonic communication. So the wiretap laws that would apply to listening in on cell phone conversations don't actually apply to listening to authorities listening in on OnStar conversations, and that too has been done and introduced in court cases.
Explain biometrics and what they can do now because it's vastly expanded capacity in computers. Apparently, I have the word right? Not biometrics. It's replacing fingerprinting.
Well, biometrics just means things that are measured with respect to you. So fingerprints are an example of biometrics, and retinal scans are an example of biometrics, and facial recognition is an example of biometrics. And
they'll take 100 points on your face, the cheeks.
And all that means is stuff that's you. Gosh, doing DNA sequencing on people, which people are starting to be able to do. So if you sort of do this, you can tell it was me who touched it. Those are examples of biometrics, and those technologies are getting better, and we can store more and all sorts of things.
So already, you know, the airports are introducing clear card lanes, so for $200 now you actually have to pay for this privilege.
Yeah.
But you get through the short line if you're willing to have an iris scan, and when you when you walk through, I think it's an iris scan and a fingerprint. I think. I think what it is. But the interesting development is that there's a lot of less less intrusive thing. You know, you actually have to go up to get the iris scan done. But there's a lot of things about your gait and, as you say, taking some measurements, that can be done by cameras at a distance.
Yeah.
Which there are efforts underway to try to get enough data on the way people walk and their size and shape and general skin color and so on, to enable them to be uniquely identified at a distance, you see. Then it would not require the cooperation of doing a fingerprint or doing the iris scan or something like that. And there's all kinds of discussions going on about the Real ID Act, which would be a sort of national identification card issue, and that may all prove within a few years to be somewhat irrelevant, because we can all be identified by these these physical characteristics.
And frankly speaking, I know people who travel so much that $200 to get through quickly would be a bargain.
Absolutely.
Well, that's the annoyance. That's the non-annoyance tax, like the privacy tax.
Right.
If I don't want to be annoyed at airports, I can choose to pay a tax, so I don't be annoyed.
Yeah. And if I don't want to be annoyed at an airplane, I can get rich enough to buy my own airplane.
Right.
And that's not bloody. Two things that seem dangerous. Cookies, you might explain what cookies are, and de-identification, which seems to be quite relevant with medical data and dangerous.
Well, what a cookie is. A cookie comes from the original ones of these. We're doing a takeoff on Sesame Street, where there would be a little program that was called the Cookie Monster that said, you shut me off by giving me a magic cookie. And then from that, this idea of cookie. A cookie is a little piece of information that when you go visit something on the web, the website you're visiting will put something on your computer to remember who you are. So the fact that when you go to Amazon, that Amazon says, hey, here's your account, and you can look at your account. The way they know it's you is that there's a cookie stored there. So that's the way that websites remember things about you. And like anything else, it's incredibly convenient that when you go to a website, it remembers you, and at the same time, it knows that it's you. And then the other thing that happens is Amazon can make a partnership with some other company, so the two of them together can now both know everything about you, and people have been more or less upset about this over the last decade.
And before you get to the identification, they have metadata, which means they can learn more about, they can tell what printer and what time of day and who did it, or maybe not quite who did it, but well, explain what the metadata is.
So metadata is, in general, computer readable. Meta means about, right? So it's information about the information. So for example, you might send somebody a Word document a memo that you're writing. What goes along with that sometimes is who you are and what date it was written, whether or not you filled it in the memo or not. As you said, some printers actually print data that say what the printer serial number is.
Yeah.
You don't see that. What you can see is if you take photographs. So you can go look at a photograph on your computer, and you can find a place where you'll see the aperture speed and the date and the camera type and all that. All that is metadata, and it's not inherently.
They sort of caught Tony Blair in a lie involving Iraq by means of metadata, didn't they?
Yeah, because there's stuff recorded there. Any number of the actual fun one is that lots of us have typed memos on the computer, and we do online editing, and we edit out some embarrassing thing, and we think better of it. Well, if you're not careful, that data is all still there. It just may not be you're choosing not to view it. And there have been lots of examples where people have sent business memos that have contained the raw stuff that was edited out when whoever thought better of it.
Yeah. And they figured out from that who really wrote something that Tony Blair claimed was written in a foreign office was actually written by his flax. And they found that out through them.
Right. And then the great example which we cite and actually have a nice illustration of the deleted word problem, the problem of the edited document containing some of the text that had been edited out, was a report by the United Nations, a very high stakes document. It was a report on the assassination of Rafik Hariri in Lebanon. Oh, yes. And the UN, there was suspicion that that the president of Syria had somehow been involved in it. Yeah. And when the document was released, it turned out that the sort of ghostly traces of the deletion, which said in the text, high Syrian officials, and what it actually said was the name of the brother of the president of Syria. So, these things have very high stakes consequences.
And as I remember it, Harry, there was also a theory that the guy who was in charge did this deliberately, knowing that the Syrians would crack it because he wanted to send them a warning.
Well, that was the theory. This is Middle Eastern stuff we're talking about here.
Layers of stuff.
Yeah, mirrors and mirrors.
But I think the general point is that you have to remember, when we're doing stuff in the digital world, that's an illusion that somebody has constructed. Right? I mean, your desktop on the computer isn't really a desktop. The trash can isn't really a trash can. When you blot something out into paper, you're not really taking some ink and saturating some paper with the thing. That's all an illusion, and those illusions can be more or less faithful to the stuff you think they are.
It's really just a bunch of electronic bits inside the computer.
It's just a constructed thing. When you say, if I see something that I put paper in a picture of a trash can and do a thing that says empty the trash, and that image of the paper disappears and it makes some cute sound, that's not really somehow being ripped up.
And there was something you folks said, that sometimes people will white out stuff, and they think that this is like using whiteout on a piece of paper, and you can't get. Well, somebody who's smart simply reverse engineers it, so to speak.
Well, but what was the whiteout? The whiteout was, there's a picture on the screen, and somebody changed what that picture is. Yeah. That didn't make anything go away necessarily.
Yeah, just overlaid the picture.
Of a magic marker.
And right.
It's just make a big black stripe, and there's a big black bar over it. It must be gone. Well, it's not gone.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a word for this in art, where you uncover. The word is escaping me at the moment, where there's something underneath what you think the picture is.
Palimpsest or something?
Yes, a palimpsest.
But here it's not even that. I mean, if you think about what's happening, in that kind of example, there's actually paint, and you think about removing the paint.
Yeah.
All that's happened in this is there was a picture on the screen, and somebody changed what the picture is.
Yeah. Explain de-identification, which seems to be very important for medical purposes.
Well, the issue here is that there's lots of for example, epidemiological data about people's medical conditions and public health records and so on, which is extremely valuable for research purposes. You want to know how diseases spread and and so on. And but there are privacy concerns about revealing, who has diseases. None of us wants that information being poured over, even by, research physicians that we trust, and they don't have any particular reason to want to know the name of the person who has this particular syndrome or that most of the time. They're happy just to deal with the data. But it turns out that the art of removing enough data so that the remaining data cannot be combined with other public sources of information to figure out who the individuals are, who the individuals actually are, that's actually a very tricky business, because there are so many public databases, voter registration databases, for example, that have lots of information about where you live and what your name is and what your age is and what your gender is and so on. And so it turns out, for example, that just knowing date of birth, gender, and zip code, 5-digit zip code, is enough to uniquely identify, I think, 87%, 86, 80-something, 85 or 86% of the population uniquely. There's only, in large parts of the country, there will only be a single person with that particular combination of, so a medical database that retains even that much information, which is all the sort of thing that a epidemiologist would want to know without wanting to know your name necessarily. They want to know sort of, you know, roughly where you live and, you know, how old you are and you know. It's very hard to strip out enough data to make the data truly anonymous without taking out so much data that it's useful for research purposes. Yeah. And so this is a difficult point of collision between privacy laws on the other end, privacy, you know, regulations on the one hand, and, you know, the public's interest in having, for example, you know, medical research done.
Not to mention that when, if I remember correctly, Harry, when discs are lost, or there was somebody who did an experiment by seeing what they could get back from discs, well, when you put together what you're just talking about, how from very little you can find out about a specific individual.
Yeah.
Plus people are stealing discs or they're not wiping them clean. This actually becomes fairly dangerous.
You know, dangerous. I mean, there's just all this information that gets out, and you can correlate it with all sorts of other information, and you can find out an awful lot about an awful lot of people.
Yeah, well, you know, I respect the fact that you don't want to use the word dangerous, but I'm a lawyer.
Well, I'll give you a dangerous. This one's not in the book, but I would have put it in if I'd known it beforehand. This is courtesy of our colleague Latanya Sweeney, who's a professor at Carnegie Mellon and was one of Hal's students when she was at MIT, that for people born since 1987, their Social Security number can be calculated by knowing what state they were born in and what day they were born on. Social Security numbers, so you don't have to go find their Social Security numbers, although people do leave their Social Security numbers around in places where they shouldn't be seen. But because Social Security numbers are given out at birth, and they're essentially given out in serial order with the first 3 digits representing a state code, and the Social Security death index giving all that information about people who are dead. So there's lots of, you know, there is lots of reason to be worried.
I want to get into the search engine part, which is another extremely important part of the book. But one question before I do. Explain, if you would, the Internet's basic architecture, the core machines as well as the surface machines. I don't have the right word.
Right. But, I'll let Hal talk about that.
And so the ways in which, there was some way in which Microsoft tried to change this, but I guess so far hasn't succeeded. So start with the core how does the Internet work? What's the architecture of it?
Well, it's basically the word Internet, right? It's a bunch of networks that are hooked together.
Computers.
There are things called hubs and switches, and they run on large cables that hook things together. But the main point of it is that they can be hooked together. So what's really important is that there's an agreement about how information is carried across it. Information is broken up into things that are called packets. And the business of the parts of the Internet are to hand packets from one part of it to another. So basically, if you're sitting at home, if you're sitting at home with your computer at home, and you're talking to the BBC news service in England, so that goes through a whole bunch of intermediaries. But the main point is they have all agreed on what's called the format for how to transmit these packets. So if I would like to join the Internet and add a new piece to it, all I need to do is agree with this one format about packets. And that's been the critical thing that's made the network successful since the very, very beginning. The fact that there's a standard that everyone has agreed upon. And the other interesting thing about the standard is it's only about how you transmit the packets. So it's not about, for your part of the Internet, you're going to transmit speech in a special way. It's that everybody can kind of join the club by just making this agreement about this one standard. So that's the critical thing about the Internet.
As I understand it, I thought your example of postcards was great. These packets are like dividing up War and Peace into 25,000 postcards and sending the postcards, and one will go 1 second, another one will go another second, and so on and so forth. And at the other end, it all gets put together, so it comes out War and Peace.
Right, because these things have serial numbers on them, and they say, gee, I'm getting them, and I'm going to put them together in this order.
But the remarkable thing is that the the network design was only about postcards, and it's still today only about postcards.
Yeah.
Now, in fact, the thing now runs so quickly, just because of Moore's Law and all of the other advances, that people have figured out how to use this same underlying packet passing protocol for transmitting telephone calls, which essentially the audio gets written down on postcards, dumped into the network. The postcards get delivered very, very quickly. Not all through the same route, but they all have serial numbers on. They get reassembled at the other end, and you've got Skype or one of these voice over.
And the video might go through different packets and the different routes.
Different routes, absolutely, and they get assembled at the other end.
Yeah.
You know, in the case of a telephone call, you may lose a few packets, but it doesn't really matter because it's only audio, and you wouldn't even notice the difference. A little, you know, hardly. Other kinds of documents, you know, the higher reliability is needed, but. So the genius of the original network design was to make the fundamental operation of passing a packet from one link to the next so simple that creative people operating at the ends, the so-called ends of the network, that you know, have been able to develop all of these things that were never anticipated in terms of streaming video and internet telephony and all of these applications, which in the 70s, when the internet basics were being worked out, nobody even imagined.
Yeah. And as I understand it, I mean, I thought it was a great analogy. You said it's also a lot like electric plugs in your wall, because they'll get electricity from any power station anywhere, and you can hook any device to it, which meant that people were free to experiment with new kinds of devices to hook to it, and new kinds of power sources, from hydroelectric to nuclear to wind to you name it.
Well,
that's what's happening on the internet now.
Well, that's the critical thing, that the thing you want to standardize is the thing that connects stuff together.
Yeah.
And then, you know, so any device that has an electric plug can plug in and get electricity.
Because if you had to have, just to carry it forward just a bit, if, say, some company says, gee, we got this great device, now we're going to use our own power source, and you're going to have to use our types of blah, 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 then you no longer have something that's usable by anybody, anytime. And therefore, innovation is going to be stifled.
Right, and that sort of stuff happens all the time. And you get a few people using it. You know, sometimes it takes off, sometimes it creates its own standard, but mostly it doesn't.
I mean, to some extent, Microsoft's attempts to put everything on its desktop accomplish the same kind of purpose through different means, but they accomplish the same kind of purpose, keeping other people out, which you would do if you didn't have a standard. All right, I guess we don't have to get into that. Let's talk about search engines. Search engines are, as I understand what you said, methods of, on the one hand, finding almost anything you want to find, and on the other hand, controlling what people are able to find. Now, if I have that right, kindly explain it, and if I have it wrong, explain that too.
Well, everybody who's in marketing knows what's really critical is for you to control what products go on which shelves in the supermarket. Everybody knows that. There's certain things you put at eye level and certain things you put way at the bottom. And
yeah, they pay plenty for that too.
Right, and they pay plenty for that. Now, if you think about the internet, that phenomenon is multiplied a millionfold. Because, you know, if you go to Google and search for something, you're not going to see anything on page 10.
Right.
You're going to be, you know, somebody's lucky if you're going to look below the first 5.
Yeah.
And so this whole notion of what you might call the product placement of things on the web is an enormously powerful thing. And
so that the first thing that's of importance to any kind of vendor or seller is to get a high placement on the first page.
Absolutely.
First, to be number 1 on the first page to be number 2 is good, but it's not as good as being number 1, and so on and so forth.
And it's way, way, way better than being number 6.
Yes. And so people use different kinds of tricks, tactics, call it what you will. There's even companies that advise about this and how you can get.
We should be clear just about these search engine screens, because like on the Google screen or most search engines, you know, there's a right-hand column
Right.
which is just pay for placement.
That's
Those are
called
just
sponsored
advertisements, and they're colored a little differently or something like that. So that's just a cash deal between the search engine company and the advertiser. So what we're really talking about now is the main search engine results, where you can't literally just pay Google or Yahoo or Microsoft for higher placement. They have their own ways of deciding what's more important than others. But what you can do is you can hire a search engine optimization company, which will claim to, and often does, know something about the methods that Google uses for ranking, and will try to fix your web page so it'll turn up higher in their search order.
Now, these methods that are used for ranking, which I guess could be called algorithms,
Yes.
Are private.
Right.
Yes, they're private because Google, first of all, it gives them a competitive advantage to keep them private.
These are trade secrets.
But secondly, they don't want people faking them out.
Okay.
So,
but they're trade secrets because if they didn't have these as trade secrets, they wouldn't be Google. Anybody could do what they were doing. And so forth.
Right, but that's one reason. But the other reason is if everybody knew what they were doing, then everybody could fake it out. Then everybody could say, I know what the algorithm's doing, I'm going to trick it into making you number
Now,
one.
it seems to me important, and I think you made a rather large to-do about this, and I think rightly so, that these search engines, whether they be Yahoo or Google or what have you, they don't claim to be subjective opinions about the quality of your piece versus somebody else's piece. They may do this, try to do this in an ersatz way by, well, how many people linked with you? But fundamentally, they're not, it's not as if you asked either Noam Chomsky on the one side or Thomas Friedman on the other or David Brooks, which of these two pieces is better on this subject? Doesn't work that way.
They're essentially relying on some kind of popular vote about what's important, and you know, I think what's the motto? Democracy works, or something like that. Google has some such motto that it uses. So they do not have their own subject area experts thinking about what's better and what's worse. Not at all. It's an intrinsic property of the network itself, at least most of the time. We give a couple of examples that challenge the limits on that. But
now, Democracy Works is very interesting, Harry, because, you know, I don't want to get into this, but this really implicates the basis of our whole political system. Because, you know, if Joe Clod clicks on something 200 times, that's a lot better than if Einstein clicks on it once.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So their job, you know, look, Google wants people to use Google. Yahoo wants people to use Yahoo. MSN wants people to use MSN. Their figure of merit, and it's monetized by how much advertising they can attract, which is based on how much people use their search engines, is are they giving people what they want? So so their job in life, in the order, in determining what turns up on the first page and what turns up at the top versus the bottom of the first page, is giving most people what they want most of the time. And most of the time, what they want may not be the obscure thing that you happen to be looking for. So I mean, we give this wonderful example, you know, where, you know, suppose you were researching medieval spears or something from the British Museum, and you typed in spears. Well, guess what you'd get? You wouldn't get anything about medieval weaponry. You'd get 10 pages of Britney Spears and a few pages of her little sister, and then there's a couple of other people who would turn up as well. Because that's mostly when people type spears into search engines, they're looking for Britney, and so that's mostly what you get back.
What really moved me, Harry, was the one about the National Cancer Institute.
Right.
Because you wouldn't get the National Cancer Institute until they changed their website due to the advice of one of these optimization companies, I guess. And that's real quality that you're not going to be finding.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. The government has no particular... Government sources are not intrinsically considered any more authoritative than anywhere else. An interesting thing that's happened over the last few years is that Wikipedia which is this publicly edited encyclopedia,
Yeah.
which actually is very high quality most of the time, but it's a controversial thing. Very often Wikipedia entries are now the highest entries, and it's just the way the algorithms have placed them.
Yeah. And just to carry this one step further, by the nature of what you have been discussing, how many times the people hit on you, link, and so on. I mean, a minority or unconventional view is almost certain to be ranked low and never seen. It's something of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Unless you happen to know how to look for it. Unless you say, I want to see, not what David Gergen thinks. I want to know what Larry Velvel thinks, who doesn't know television every day. So, your view would not be up there with David Gergen's view, although I could probably find it, but I'd have to know what I was looking for.
Yeah. Now, it's also, I think this is a very poignant, pertinent thing that you do. It's also a method of thought control.
Right.
Now, explain that.
You want to take that, or shall I?
Well, I mean, basically, what you're doing is you're shaping the popular view of this network, because the network isn't what's on the network; it's what people see on the network.
Yeah.
And you're
so
controlling
number
this
one,
window.
because it's what people see, it's shaping their views that way. And if you're China,
Right.
or even if you're the United States, as to certain things like pornography, you're borrowing these from the internet, and from search engines, and you're borrowing people from seeing it to begin with, like Falun Gong, that kind of stuff.
Right. So Falun Gong. So the example that we give in our book is one of the things you can do that's very interesting is, from sitting in the U.S., you can search Google China, for example. So instead of going to google.com, you go to google.com.cn, and that's sort of nice, so you can see how the different countries appear, and you'll find very, very different results. If you go search for Falun Gong in the U.S., you'll see a bunch of articles about Falun Gong being the kind of organization it is. If you search in China, you'll mostly see things that are critical of Falun Gong.
Fundamentally, a Chinese person's getting a much different view about Falun Gong than an American person is.
And the important thing here is that this is not democracy at work. This is not because the Chinese would have a preference for this particular view. This is because Google has made a deal with the Chinese government that they had to make in order to be allowed to operate in China at all, whereby they would use what I call the distorting lens. They wouldn't put a clear piece of glass, which we like to think we're seeing through these search engines most of the time, but through a particular view, at least insofar as particular subjects. Tibetan independence would be another one, where the picture that you get inside China is, and which you can see if you use, anybody can do this. Just go to Google, and then instead of saying google.com, just change it to google.cn, and you'll get some, not exactly, but you'll get a close approximation to what it would be like to use these tools.
As I understand it, another thing search engines, number one, search engines do this stuff by crawling the web. I mean, they read every web page around.
Right. It's amazing.
Now, and they cache some of them so that even when Larry Summers' nasty comments about women got taken down, you still got them.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I mean, what happens is, this notion of visiting a web page, that's another one of these metaphors, which doesn't reflect what actually happens, or viewing a web page. We think of we're viewing a web page like I'm viewing that tree out the window there. The tree has no notion that I'm looking at it. It's passive, and I'm active, and I'm looking at it. But that isn't what happens. When you view a web page, you're sending a message to the web page saying, please, web page, web server, please send the page back to me. So Google views all these web pages and then keeps copies of them all. And it'll show you the copies. If you, underneath the search engine results, it says cached. If you click on cached, you'll see sometimes a version of the web page that isn't actually there on the actual web server anymore.
Yeah. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is often interred with their bones. We didn't get to copyright, and we're out of time. Wow. Suffice it to say that you folks, anybody who reads your book ought to spend significant time reading what you have to say about copyright.
Please.
Because this is a different world. This is a new world with regard to copyright. Now that anybody can send out 100,000 versions of something in a press of a button, copyright has got to be completely revamped. That's the bottom line.
The law is broken.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. Well, gentlemen, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for coming up from.
Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. And now you can join the long crimson line returning to Cambridge from Andover. Thank you very much. And to the audience, thank you, and be with us again next time.